You know that strange feeling when everyone in the room is laughing, but you suddenly realize you're the joke? That happened to me at my daughter's wedding. And by the end of the night, the same people mocking me would be staring at me like they had seen a ghost. But to understand how everything exploded so badly, you need to know what my life looked like before that wedding day. 2 years earlier, I was 61 years old, divorced, unemployed, and honestly terrified about my future. After spending nearly 3 decades managing operations for a logistics company, I was suddenly replaced during a corporate restructuring. That's the polished business phrase companies use when they want younger employees with smaller salaries. One Friday afternoon, I walked out carrying a cardboard box with my coffee mug, a dying office plant, and absolutely no clue what came next. My daughter, Emily, tried to comfort me at first. "Mom, maybe this is the universe telling you to finally relax." Relax. I hated that word. Relax sounded too much like surrender. Meanwhile, my ex-husband had already remarried a woman young enough to still use phrases like soft launching my relationship online. My friends kept suggesting gardening clubs, yoga retreats, and retirement cruises, as if life was already over. But something inside me refused to accept that. I had spent 30 years solving business problems, organizing chaos, fixing broken systems, and keeping companies alive during disasters. Why should all that knowledge suddenly become worthless because of a birthday? So instead of retiring, I started a consulting company. Nothing flashy. I helped struggling businesses improve efficiency, reduce waste, and manage operations better. I called the company Harper Strategic Solutions. First it was tiny. 1 client became 2. 2 became 6. Then referrals started spreading. Within a year, I was earning more money than I ever had at my old job. But my family treated the entire thing like an embarrassing hobby. Emily would laugh every time I mentioned a new client. "Mom," she'd say, "you're acting like some startup founder from TikTok." Her fiancé, Daniel, was worse. That man explained business concepts to me the way people explain smartphones to grandparents. "Have you thought about keeping this smaller?" he once asked. "You don't want to stress yourself out at your age." At my age, I started hearing that phrase constantly. My sister told me I should be realistic. My cousins called my business phase cute. Even my closest friends spoke to me like I was experimenting with arts and crafts instead of running a real company. And the craziest part? None of them knew how successful I was becoming. Because while everyone assumed I was pretending to be important, I was quietly building something massive. By the time Emily's wedding arrived, I had partnered with multiple regional companies and invested in several expanding firms. But I kept most of it private, partly because I preferred peace, and partly because my own daughter seemed embarrassed by my ambition. A week before the wedding, she sat me down during rehearsal dinner preparations. "Mom, one thing," she said carefully. "Daniel's company executives are coming to the wedding. Please don't start talking about your business stuff with them." I blinked. "My business stuff? You know what I mean," she sighed. "I just don't want people thinking you're trying too hard." Trying too hard. That one hurt. But I swallowed it because I loved her. The wedding day itself was beautiful. Crystal chandeliers. Soft piano music. White roses everywhere. Emily looked stunning walking down the aisle, and despite everything, I cried watching my little girl get married. For a few hours everything felt perfect. Then the speeches started. And that's when my daughter stood up, grabbed the microphone, smiled at 200 guests, and turned me into the punchline of the night. What she said next made the entire room burst into laughter. But one man at table 7 suddenly stopped smiling completely. Because unlike everyone else in that ballroom, he knew exactly who I really was. When my daughter mocked my little business in front of her husband's executives, she had no idea one of those executives worked for a company I secretly owned. The ballroom erupted with laughter the second Emily raised her champagne glass and smiled into the microphone. "You all know my mom," she said proudly. Apparently, at 61 years old, she's decided she's going to become a business mogul. More laughter. I felt my stomach tighten instantly. "She keeps talking about partnerships, expansion plans, acquisitions," Emily continued, using dramatic finger quotes while the guests chuckled harder. "Meanwhile, we're all just hoping she eventually discovers retirement and knitting." Even the bridesmaids laughed. I forced a smile onto my face while my chest burned with humiliation. Then Daniel grabbed the microphone from her. "Oh, it gets better," he joked. "She actually talks like she's running a Fortune 500 company." The room exploded again. Someone at a nearby table nearly spilled their drink laughing. I sat perfectly still. My cheeks were hot. My hands shook under the tablecloth. But the worst part wasn't the laughter. It was seeing my daughter enjoying it. She wasn't uncomfortable. She wasn't nervous. She genuinely thought humiliating me publicly was funny. Daniel kept going. "We support her little entrepreneurial adventure, of course," he said. "It's important for people to have hobbies after retirement." Hobbies? 30 years of experience. Hundreds of sleepless nights rebuilding my life after divorce. Millions in business deals. Reduced to a hobby. I glanced around the ballroom. Some guests looked uncomfortable. Others were fully entertained. And then I noticed one man at table 7. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't laughing at all. He looked confused. Then serious. Then deeply uncomfortable. That man was Michael Carter, Senior Operations Director at Nexicor Technologies, the company Daniel worked for. At the time, I didn't realize how much trouble was about to unfold. After the speeches ended, people started approaching me with fake sympathy disguised as encouragement. One woman patted my arm gently. "Well, good for you for staying busy." Busy. Another guest smiled politely and said, "It's never too late to dream small." Dream small. I wanted to disappear. But I stayed calm because I refused to ruin my daughter's wedding. Then Daniel approached me during cocktail hour holding 2 glasses of champagne. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Don't take the speeches personally. Emily was just teasing." "I know," I answered quietly. He nodded like he was comforting a child. "But honestly, it's kind of inspiring seeing you try new things at your age. Try new things." Like I had started finger painting instead of negotiating corporate contracts. Then he leaned closer. "Just promise me you're not risking your savings on this business fantasy." Business fantasy. That phrase almost made me laugh. Because Daniel had absolutely no idea who he was talking to. No one did. Not my daughter. Not the guests. Not even most of the executives walking around that ballroom. They all saw an older divorced woman driving an old sedan and living quietly in a modest apartment. They assumed modesty meant failure. What they didn't know was that over the previous 18 months I had quietly purchased controlling interests in 4 rapidly growing companies. And one of those companies, Nexicor Technologies, the same company Daniel proudly worked for. Inside the bathroom stall, I sat there silently trying not to cry. Not because strangers laughed at me, but because my own child genuinely believed I was pathetic. That hurt more than anything else. When I finally came back out, the reception was louder now. Music played. People danced. Champagne glasses clinked across the ballroom. And near the bar, I overheard Emily talking to one of her bridesmaids. "Honestly," Emily whispered with a laugh, "Mom's business obsession is just her coping mechanism after the divorce." The bridesmaid nodded sympathetically. "Poor thing." "I mean," Emily continued, "it's harmless as long as she doesn't embarrass herself too badly." That sentence shattered something inside me. Harmless. Embarrassing. Pathetic. That's truly how she saw me. I turned away before they noticed me listening. And at that exact moment, a voice behind me said something that made my entire body freeze. "Miss Harper." I slowly turned around. It was Michael Carter from table 7. And the expression on his face told me everything. Because unlike everyone else in that ballroom, he had finally figured out exactly who I was. When Daniel's executive looked me in the eyes and whispered, "You own Nexicor." You. I realized the secret I'd hidden for 2 years was about to explode in front of 200 wedding guests. "Miss Harper." I turned around slowly and saw Michael Carter standing behind me near the champagne bar. But now his face looked completely different. Gone was the polite wedding smile. Gone was the casual executive confidence. Instead, he looked stunned, almost nervous. "I'm sorry," he said carefully, lowering his voice. "This may sound crazy, but are you Eleanor Harper? Harper Strategic Holdings?" For a second, my heart stopped. So he knew. After 2 years of staying invisible, someone had finally connected the dots. I glanced around the ballroom instinctively. Nobody nearby seemed to notice our conversation. Yet, yes, I answered quietly. I am. Michael actually inhaled sharply. Oh my God. He ran a hand through his hair and stared at me in disbelief. I knew I recognized you, he muttered. But Daniel kept describing you like you were running some tiny consulting side hustle. Tiny consulting side hustle. I almost laughed at how absurd it sounded now. Michael looked genuinely horrified. Does Emily know who you are? I shook my head slowly. No. And Daniel? No. The poor man looked physically uncomfortable, like he suddenly realized he'd watched a disaster unfold in slow motion. Miss Harper, he whispered, do they have any idea that you own Nexicor? I stayed silent. That silence answered everything. Michael closed his eyes for a second like he needed emotional recovery time, because Nexicor wasn't some little local company. It was a rapidly expanding tech infrastructure corporation valued at nearly $80 million. And 6 months earlier, through a private acquisition deal, I had become the majority stakeholder. Technically speaking, Daniel worked for me. Not directly, but high enough in the chain for it to matter. Very much. Michael looked back toward the ballroom where guests were still laughing and dancing under glowing chandeliers. I cannot believe what I just watched, he said quietly. It's fine, I replied automatically. No, he said firmly. It's not fine. That surprised me. Most people avoid uncomfortable truths, but Michael looked genuinely disturbed. The speeches, he continued carefully. The comments, they publicly humiliated you. I forced a small smile. They didn't know. But that's the problem, he replied immediately. Why did nobody bother to know? That question hit harder than I expected. Because he was right. Not once had my daughter seriously asked about my work. Not once had Daniel shown genuine curiosity. They decided who I was based entirely on my age. And once people make assumptions about older women, they stop listening completely. Michael exhaled slowly. You know, he said. Half the executives in this ballroom would panic if they realized who you are. I glanced around the room, and suddenly I noticed things differently. The vice president from one of my subsidiary firms was near the dance floor. A regional operations manager from another acquisition was standing beside the dessert table. 2 investors I recognized from a recent merger discussion were seated near the stage. And every single one of them had spent the evening treating me like a harmless old woman, with unrealistic dreams. The irony was almost unbelievable. Before I could respond, Daniel suddenly walked toward us smiling casually. There you are, he said to Michael. I was wondering where you disappeared to. Then he looked at me. Oh good, he laughed. You two finally met. Michael's expression instantly became awkward. Painfully awkward. Daniel didn't notice. He kept smiling. So what do you think of my mother-in-law's entrepreneurial journey? He joked. Pretty inspiring, right? Michael stared at him. I have never seen a human being realize danger so quickly without understanding why. Daniel laughed again. She's been really committed to this business thing lately. Business thing. Michael blinked slowly. Daniel, he said carefully, do you know exactly what your mother-in-law does? Daniel shrugged casually. She does some consulting work. Small business operations stuff, I think. Michael looked physically speechless. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then Daniel added the sentence that destroyed whatever composure remained. It keeps her busy, he chuckled. Michael's face changed instantly. Not anger. Not shock. Pure horror. Because at that exact moment, he realized he was watching a man unknowingly insult the owner of the company paying his salary. Daniel, Michael said slowly, I really think you should stop talking. Daniel laughed nervously. What? Michael turned toward me. His eyes silently asked permission. And for the first time all night, I was tired of hiding. So I gave him a small nod. That tiny gesture changed everything. Michael looked back at Daniel carefully. Then he said 5 words that made the entire world stop. Your mother-in-law owns Nexicor. Daniel smiled for half a second. Then the color completely drained from his face. What? Nearby conversations started fading as people noticed the tension. Michael continued quietly. She's not running a hobby business. Eleanor Harper is one of the most successful investors in the entire sector. Daniel stared at me blankly. No, he whispered. That's impossible. But deep down, he already knew it was true. And unfortunately for him, the secret was no longer staying private, because several nearby executives had just overheard everything. And one of them was already walking toward the microphone stand. The moment the executive grabbed the microphone at my daughter's wedding, I realized the humiliation was about to shift away from me and land directly on the people who mocked me all night. The second Michael Carter stepped toward the microphone, my stomach dropped. I immediately grabbed his arm. Please don't, I whispered. This is still my daughter's wedding. But Michael looked deeply unsettled, almost offended on my behalf. With respect, Miss Harper, he said quietly. After the way they treated you tonight, people deserve to know the truth. Before I could stop him, he tapped the microphone. The sharp screech echoed across the ballroom. Music stopped instantly. Conversations faded. 200 guests slowly turned toward the stage. And suddenly, every chandelier-lit table in that beautiful reception hall became painfully silent. Michael cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, he began carefully, I apologize for interrupting the celebration, but I need to address something important. Emily looked confused immediately. Daniel looked terrified. I remained frozen near the bar. Michael continued. Tonight, many of us participated in jokes regarding the mother of the bride and her so-called late-life business hobby. The room became awkwardly still. You could actually feel people realizing something was wrong. Michael looked directly at the crowd. The problem, he said firmly, is that the majority of us completely misunderstood who we were talking about. Now people looked nervous, especially the executives, especially Daniel. Michael turned toward me respectfully. Mrs. Harper has been treated tonight like a woman pretending to understand business. He paused. But Eleanor Harper is not pretending. And then he dropped the bomb that shattered the entire reception. She is the majority owner of Nexicor Technologies. Gasps exploded across the ballroom. Someone literally dropped a wine glass. I heard one woman whisper, "What?" Emily's face went completely white. Daniel looked like he had forgotten how breathing worked. But Michael wasn't finished. In fact, he continued, Mrs. Harper owns significant stakes in multiple companies represented in this very room. Now executives started panicking visibly. People were whispering rapidly at tables. Phones came out. Faces changed instantly. The same guests who had spent hours mocking me suddenly looked like employees during a surprise audit. Michael gestured toward me again. While people here laughed about her cute little consulting business, Mrs. Harper quietly built one of the fastest-growing investment portfolios in the region. Dead silence. No more laughter. No more jokes. Just shock. Pure shock. Emily slowly stood from her chair near the sweetheart table. "Mom," she whispered weakly. "Is this true?" Every eye in the ballroom turned toward me. I didn't want this moment. I never wanted public attention. But after everything that had happened, I was done shrinking myself to protect people who had no problem humiliating me. So I slowly walked toward the microphone. The room stayed completely silent except for my heels against the marble floor. I accepted the microphone gently. "Yes," I said calmly. "It's true." Another wave of whispers exploded through the ballroom. Emily looked like she might cry. Daniel looked physically sick. I continued speaking softly. I never lied to anyone tonight. I simply didn't correct assumptions people chose to make about me. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks anymore. You all assumed that because I'm older, divorced, and living modestly, my business couldn't possibly be successful. Several people immediately looked down at the floor. You assumed ambition has an expiration date. That sentence hit the room like a hammer. I looked directly at Emily then. Honey, when you joked about my little business, you were talking about companies employing hundreds of people. Tears instantly filled her eyes. When you said I should act my age, I continued gently, you were mocking accomplishments I had already achieved. Emily covered her mouth. Daniel stepped forward awkwardly. Eleanor, No, I interrupted calmly. Please let me finish. For the first time all night, nobody dared interrupt me. You know what hurt the most tonight? I asked quietly. It wasn't the jokes. I looked directly at my daughter. It was realizing my own child truly believed I was embarrassing simply because I refused to disappear quietly after 60. Emily burst into tears immediately. Several guests looked deeply uncomfortable now. Good. They should. Because humiliation feels very different when the spotlight finally turns around. I handed the microphone back to Michael and took a slow breath. Then I smiled softly at the room. Now, I said calmly, this day is supposed to be about celebrating the bride and groom. So let's please continue the wedding. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then slowly, the music restarted. But the energy in the room had completely changed. The same executives who ignored me earlier suddenly approached with nervous respect. People who laughed at me wouldn't even make eye contact anymore. And Emily? She stood frozen beside Daniel with mascara running down her face, finally realizing the woman she mocked all night was the most powerful person in the entire ballroom. But the hardest conversation of the night still hadn't happened yet. Because 30 minutes later, my daughter followed me outside the venue crying. And what she said next changed our relationship forever. When my daughter ran outside crying after the wedding reception, I thought she was finally coming to apologize. But what she admitted instead hurt even more than the public humiliation. About 30 minutes after the reception returned to normal, I quietly stepped outside the venue for some air. The night was cool. Soft garden lights glowed around the courtyard, and distant music still drifted through the ballroom windows behind me. For the first time all evening, everything was finally quiet. But inside my chest, nothing felt quiet. I leaned against the stone railing and closed my eyes for a moment. Then I heard heels clicking behind me. Mom! Emily's voice cracked the second she said it. I turned around slowly. Mascara streaked her cheeks. Her wedding makeup was ruined. And for the first time that night, she didn't look angry or embarrassed. She looked broken. I'm so sorry, she whispered immediately. I stayed silent. Because honestly, sorry didn't magically erase what happened inside that ballroom. Emily wrapped her arms around herself like she was freezing. I can't believe I did that to you, she said through tears. In front of everyone. I looked at her carefully. You didn't just joke about me, Emily. She lowered her eyes instantly. You made me feel ashamed for still believing my life mattered. That sentence hit her hard. Fresh tears rolled down her face. I never meant it like that, she whispered. Then how did you mean it? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because there wasn't a good answer. For years she had treated my ambition like a phase. A joke. A coping mechanism. And tonight she turned that belief into public entertainment. Finally, after a long silence, she admitted something that hurt even worse than the wedding. Beaches. I think, she said shakily, I got uncomfortable watching you become more successful than everyone expected. I stared at her quietly. Even she looked shocked hearing herself say it out loud. You were supposed to slow down after the divorce, she continued softly. You were supposed to settle into normal life. Normal life. There it was again. That invisible rule society places on older women. Be quieter. Smaller. Less ambitious. Less visible. Emily wiped her eyes. But instead, she whispered, you became stronger. And honestly, I didn't know how to process that. For the first time all night, I finally understood the real problem. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was discomfort. People become uncomfortable when someone refuses to fit inside the box they assigned them. Especially when that person is a woman over 60. I took a slow breath. Emily, I said gently, do you know why I never told anyone how successful the business became? She shook her head. Because I wanted to know who respected me before the money. That sentence destroyed her completely. She started crying harder. And honestly, part of me wanted to comfort her immediately. She was still my daughter. But another part of me remembered sitting silently while 200 people laughed at me. So instead I spoke honestly. What happened tonight wasn't just cruel because of the jokes, I said quietly. It was cruel. Because you never once stopped to ask who I actually was. Emily nodded through tears. You're right. And the saddest part? I continued. I would have been proud of you no matter what career path you chose, even if you failed 10 times. Her face crumpled instantly, because she realized she had never offered me that same unconditional support. Not once. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered. I looked toward the ballroom where laughter and music slowly returned inside. You don't fix trust overnight, I answered honestly. You rebuild it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emily quietly asked the question she'd probably been afraid to ask all night. Are you angry at me? I thought about it carefully. Then I answered truthfully. I was. Past tense. That seemed to surprise her. But mostly, I admitted, I was heartbroken. She started crying again. And despite everything, I finally stepped forward and hugged my daughter. Because love and pain can exist together sometimes. That's the complicated part nobody talks about. A few months later, things slowly started changing. Emily began asking real questions about my work. Not fake polite questions. Real ones. Daniel became dramatically more respectful once he realized the woman he called cute technically signed off on the company budget that paid his department. Funny how humility suddenly appears when power enters the room. As for me, I stopped minimizing myself for other people's comfort. I stopped apologizing for ambition. I stopped acting grateful just because society expected older women to disappear quietly. And the biggest lesson I learned from that wedding? Success doesn't shock people nearly as much as confidence does. Especially when it comes from someone they already decided to underestimate. So no, the best chapters of your life do not expire at 60. And sometimes the people laughing at your dreams are only laughing because they cannot imagine having your courage. But eventually, the truth always enters the room. And when it does, silence gets very loud.